Hello everyone, this is Dan, returning with a long overdue battle report. I think it's been at least a year since I've done one of these, maybe more. Um, this is a game that I played against Swelt on the forums. He's Brett in our gaming group, and his Warriors of the Dark Gods. It's a 4,500 point game, played at Gamers Heaven in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. And I brought along my dwarves, as is customary. This list was a little more competitive than the ones that I typically run, simply because I haven't played a game in probably 4 months, and I wanted something a little bit stronger to use as a crutch to make up for what I'm sure would be some tactical shortcomings. So the list is otherwise straightforward. It's a king on a war throne with Rune of Destruction and 2 Runes of Might. The only difference here, I think, between what I'm used to seeing is that I don't take much defensive gear for him just to keep him cheap. I've got a Runic Smith with 3 battle runes and a shield. And likewise, he's just cheap, does what he does. The Thane BSB is on shield bearers with a shield and Rune of Might. So I think in total I spent like 1,100 points on characters. For core then, I've got a big unit of 25 clan warriors. So the whole theme here, if you look throughout the list, and again, I'll read through everything just for the people that are painting and not really watching, is that I don't have any big combat blocks. I have a ton of scoring units, a lot of small ones, and in my mind, what is useful in this case is that the characters don't need to go anywhere specific. In other words, the units don't rely on having a character in with them, with the exception of the Deep Watch, which need a character just for bodyguard, but it could be any of the 3. So I hope that in playing games with this list or something similar to this list, I'll find that I have a lot of options in the deployment phase in terms of where to place characters. So the warriors are just that. They can run without a character and just be 25 bodies that are tough to get through. Or an escort unit for the king, whatever. I took 3 units of 10 Greybeards with shields and thrown weapons. I had oscillated between giving one of the units great weapons just for some additional versatility. And I'll play test this list a few more times to see if that's something I want to change up in the future. And then a unit of 15 Deep Watch with just a standard of Wisdom. 2 units of 4 Hold Guardians with no upgrades. 2 Vengeance Seekers, 2 Rune-crafted organ guns, and then a Flame Cannon. So it's pretty spread out. There's really no 1 unit or 2 units that can be targeted for points. You have to take down a lot of units. But, of course, the trade-off in this case is I don't have any big combat blocks to go toe-to-toe anywhere. I have to use everything really as potential chaff. So, and now we'll take a look at Brett's list. Now, he typically, lately has been running highborn elves. And I think he's got 4 or 5 armies that he alternates between. But regardless, this was his first time with this particular list, and it's pretty neat. You'll see that he takes Mark of Greed where he can. So he's got a Sorcerer, Wizard Master of Alchemy, which hurts. That's great. On a Battle Shrine, paired weapons, plate armor, Gladiator Spirit, which is the +1 armor and parry, Hero's Heart, which we all know, Icon of the Infinite is the bound spell of Hellfire, and then a magical heirloom and the Weird Stone. He has 19 warriors with the Mark of Greed, and the Mark of Greed, for those not familiar, is what grants a great weapon, a halberd, paired weapons, and weapon master. It may not grant all 3 of those, but it certainly grants weapon master and a couple weapon options. So on warriors, it's cool because they already come with a shield, so it gives them a lot of versatility for comparatively cheap, I think. I think that really it's the opportunity cost of not taking something like Sloth, but I really do think it's a cool upgrade option for warriors. And then they have the Flaming Standard. He's got a small unit of 10 warriors just for scoring, I think, and for other utility in the list. 2 Chosen Chariots, both with Mark of Greed. He's got 5 Chosen Knights, same thing, Mark of Greed, full command. Another Icon of the Infinite, so another bound spell of Hellfire. And then he has 6 Feldrax with paired weapons, full command, and the Wasteland Torch. And then finally, 2 units of 5 Flayers with Skinning Lashes, and those grant Strength 4 sweeping attacks. So a cool list. It's unconventional. It's not what I'm used to playing for warriors, but very interesting. So this was just a shot of the two armies before the game. So pre-game stuff, this was a refused flank deployment, and then it was secure target for the secondary objective. And I'll point out, if I can, the markers in the deployment phase where they sit. So I had 3 grudges, and then I naturally picked his 3 big blocks for army-wide hatred against them. And then, let's see what else. Oh, I guess the 2 units of Hold Guardians, I got to choose what they would take, and I gave them both +1 strength. In terms of spells, I had 3 through the Runesmith and 1 through the Banner, and I chose -1 to wound on the Banner, and then for the Runesmith, I chose another instance of -1 to wound, hard target distracting, and rerolls to wound, which I found to be a pretty effective combination. For his spells, he, as I mentioned, had the 2 instances of Hellfire as bound spells, and then for his selected spells, for the caster, he had Wrath of God, I think through the Battle Shrine, and then he was Alchemy, so he had Silver Spike, which is the like bolt thrower shot, D6 wounds, strength 6, D3 wounds, and then he had Curse of Iron, which is the -1 armor, and then +2 armor. Or I'm mixing up names, but that's the mechanics that he had, was -1 armor and +2 armor. So that's everything that we had for spells. Rolled for sides, he got the far board edge and I got this board edge. So let me actually go 1 slide forward, because he ended up rolling off for sides. I let him deploy first and he dropped everything. And I've found with a lot of my more recent games that's what I prefer. I'd rather be reactionary and sacrifice the first turn. I haven't found myself wishing I had the first turn a lot. So for his deployment, because he dropped first, he ended up putting down his flayers on either side of his battle line there. And again, it's refused flanks. We're on a diagonal right now, if you can't really make that out. And then next to that, the Chosen Knights. And then immediately next to that is one of the Chosen Chariots. And then the big block of warriors in the center with the Battle Shrine there. You can see the blue dot sort of in front of them. That's my marker that I placed there. And then in the next slide, I'll show you his marker and where that was placed. So this whole game is kind of played toward the center right side of the board from my perspective. Next to them in what are ruins right now, technically it's a field that he turned into ruins with the Wasteland Torch, or the Feldrax. Another chariot immediately to their left, and then, as I mentioned, the flayers next to them, and just behind them you can kind of make out the movement tray of the small unit of 10 warriors there as well. So, I mean, pretty straightforward. He's going to run at me, and I'll see what I can do about that. From my battle line, you can see, for perspective's sake here, his big unit of warriors there is the one that you can see in the upper left-hand corner there. So I am center right of his line. And as with the name of the deployment type, I'm sort of trying to go for a refused flank here. There's a water feature there, and you can see what we deem to be impassable terrain toward the center of the photo there. So I was trying to use that to kind of cut off my left flank. So down at the bottom here, what you can't see off camera, and you may have seen it in the last slide, is that the one Vengeance Seeker is way off to the left of my army, just to chaff and try to hold things up. I have the two of the units anyway of Greybeards with thrown weapons down the lower left next to the flame cannon there. And again, I can't go toe-to-toe with any of these big blocks. My only hope is to try to hold them up, shoot them, get the king there to do some damage. And so these guys are just running defense right now. I'm just going to see what I can do to use, 400 points of Greybeards to try to hold up 1,000 points, I guess, between his Chosen Knights and the chariot that's over there. As I mentioned, flame cannons there. Organ gun off on the other side of that piece of impassable terrain. And then the bulk of my battle line there is the whole Guardians up in the front, 4 of them anyway. There's the unit of Deep Watch has both the BSB and the Runesmith in it, so there's 6 wide right now. Just to the right there is the big block of Clan Warriors, which I threw the king in for this game. And then on the right, you can kind of see at this point, there's the second organ gun. and then the third unit of Greybeards immediately in front of that, and then finally, way off on the far right there is the second unit of Hold Guardians. And I forgot to mention, sort of in front of, let's see if I can zoom in here, oh that's cool, sort of in front of that unit of Clan Warriors is the second of those Vengeance Seekers. And it's a useful feature. Okay, so with that, game is started. The other of the markers is right there behind the Deep Watch. So into his, this is his battle line again, so into his vanguards anyway, he moved up with the flares on both sides. And now we're off. So in his turn one, he moves up with the flares as far as he can on both sides. In this case, it was to throw a wound on the one Vengeance Seeker off on the left. I got lucky on that. I think I rolled 3 6s for ward saves. And then off on the right-hand side, he does 2 wounds onto the organ gun. So not anything to do about that, but with the rest of his line, he moves up a little bit, not too far. You can see that the Feldrax, for example, are still sitting in those ruins. He feels pretty confident between his bound spells and his much longer movement that he can kind of wait for me to come to him, and that's what he's doing. But he did move up with the Chariot, and he does move up a little bit with that unit of Warriors. And off on my left, he moves up with the Chosen Knights and the Chosen Chariot. So just shuffling forward with everything that he can. Magic ends up being a 7 to 5 phase for him. And with this is, I'll note where I can missteps on my part. I think that's a big part of doing these battle reports, is trying to learn from them. So I made a mistake here. I was really worried about Wrath of God for obvious reasons, and -1 armor, especially early in the game. I really didn't want that getting off on one of my blocks. So I was sort of holding dice. I let Silver Spike go off on the organ gun that had already been wounded, and that was a silly thing to do because they have 5 wounds. I guess I had it in my head that they had 6, or that he'd only taken 1 wound, because I let the spell go through, and of course he ended up doing 3 wounds and killing the organ gun before we could even shoot. So that should have been and especially this first phase, that should have been a bigger priority even than Wrath of God, because Wrath of God's not going to do anything for at least a turn. So that one went off, and then Hellfire, I think through the Chosen Knights, ends up killing off the other Vengeance Seekers. So, but I did stop a couple of spells for what it's worth. Just the wrong ones, it turned out. So we're into my turn 1 then, and the Hold Guardians up on the hill charge down into that Chariot. Now, I had thought about this before the game, that I wanted these guys to be in a 4x1 formation, but I realized, especially toward the end of the game, that they probably would have been better off in a 2x2 formation. And I suppose, with rare exceptions, they might always be best off in a 2x2 formation, simply because I'm just losing out on the 2 stomps, and in most cases I have a much smaller, more compact footprint, and I'm not really losing any attacks. And indeed, in this case, I'm actually losing 3 attacks because one of the guys is not in base contact with that Chariot, and he could have been. So just food for thought. I moved up with the Vengeance Seeker as well, and really my entire line shuffles forward anyway. The Hold Guardians off on the right move up, the Greybeards move down off the hill, and then the Clan Warriors move up behind the Vengeance Seeker. And you can see everything kind of ends up like this. I debated charging the flares with the Deep Watch. He would have fled anyway, so I wasn't too worried about it, but ended up not doing it. And then off on the left, I just back up as much as I can. In my magic phase, it was a 5 to 4, small phase, but I did end up sneaking off Rune of Resilience, so -1 to wound on the Hold Guardians that are in combat with that Chariot. In the shooting phase, the Flame Cannon didn't really have much else to shoot, so he ends up doing some wounds to his flares. And then I was really concerned about that unit of 2 chaffing up things over on this side of the board, so I ended up using the organ gun to shoot at them. He really didn't have too many other great targets. Like, he could have shot at the small unit of 10 warriors, but I figured with everything else that's over there that they're not going to be a huge problem. In combat, we ended up doing 3 wounds to the Chariot, and he ended up doing 1 back to me. that -1 to wound, even though he, I think, took halberds for just about every combat, and certainly this one. -1 to wound on Hold Guardians is just brutal. So we won combat. He ends up sticking. And then we go into his turn too. So this chariot over on my left flank charges at this unit of Greybeards. They stand and shoot, sneak a wound through, and he ends up failing. It was a little bit long of a charge anyway. I think he needed 11, but he did roll pretty low for his charge. And that's where he ends up. And then over on the right flank, these warriors charge into the flank of the Hold Guardians. Again, if they'd been in a 2x2 formation, it would have been great because I would have had 2 of those guys in base contact with them, and I could have had more attacks in on them instead of on the tougher chariot. And then the rest of his army moves up like this. Again, he's still not moving those Feldraks out of the ruins there. I suppose mostly as a deterrent to make sure my organ gun doesn't shoot at them. But everything else shuffles forward. He gets a 10 to 7 phase for his second magic phase. So now this is sort of what my mindset was with the first magic phase, that a single silver spike, I'm going to let that go through because I'm not too worried about it. And that's what happened over here, 1 wound there. But again, if he'd already had 2 wounds on it, it would have been probably a bad call. And then he throws the alchemical fire onto the Deep Watch. And then he manages to get Wrath of God off anyway. So, lesson learned on that. And then Corruption of Tin goes off. I was actually relieved. I was worried he was going to try to cast this onto the Deep Watch, because obviously part of what makes Deep Watch worthwhile is that they're very high armor and hard to shift. And if you start putting -1 armor on them, it makes them a lot less useful very quickly. But he casts it on the Hold Guardians, so they're down to armor 4 instead of 3. And then this is actually the shot at the end of the combat phase. So the Hold Guardians kill the chariot, and that's Brett taking it off there. You can see kind of his hand there in the upper left-hand corner. And then they turn to face the warriors. So again, even with the -1 armor on them, the armor is really not what makes them great. It's the toughness 5 with -1 to wound off. Those warriors charging in the flank brought some good static combat res, but they couldn't do anything. They needed to wound on 6s, so didn't work great. So they turn to face, and then in my turn 2, you can see the second unit of Hold Guardians charges them in the rear there. He is a good trap. That was not intentional at all. I wasn't sure that he was going to charge me in the flank there, but it did work out nicely. Everything else moves forward. You can see the unit of Greybeards there because there's really not much more for them to do. I'm having them turn around and work their way back toward the objective on my side of the board. And this is where things sit at the end of my second movement phase. The Greybeards down on the bottom there, I just shifted them backwards as best as I could. My magic, a little bit bigger this time, is at 8 to 5 phase. And then I get lucky. I got through Rune of Oaths, so rerolls to wound, and then hard target distracting on the unit of Deep Watch, so they're a lot scarier now. And then I ended up getting -1 to wound on the Clan Warriors as well. This was a combination of, like I've said before, maybe in battle reports, certainly on the forums, that dwarves, with the way bound spells work right now, they're pretty much guaranteed to get 1 spell off unless you get unlucky. And if you get lucky, you'll get 2 spells off. In this case, it was a combination of that and the fact that at the end of the magic phase, Brett only had 2 dice left, and he ended up 1-dicing both the spells, which is risky. It could have paid off for him, but in this case, he ended up rolling too low to stop them. So I got 3 spells off, which is great for me. However, at the end of the magic phase, I guess also great for me, but Wrath of God goes off, which is never a great thing, but in this case it only rolled 3 inches for distance. So the Greybeards got pretty roughed up, but with -1 to wound off on the Clan Warriors, I think they only took 3 wounds, so not too bad anyway. Then in my shooting phase, the flame cannon took a shot at the big block of warriors. I just have to start chiseling away at it because even with spells up, the Deep Watch are going to have a hard time chewing through that unit if they end up going against them. So Flame Cannon does, I think, 2 wounds there, and the Organ Gun joins in to do 3 more. So we're starting to get through. Again, there were 19 to start. In the combat phase, yeah, this goes predictably. Those poor warriors, they did get to strike first, but I don't think they did any damage. So, yeah, or maybe they did. I guess they did 1 wound, which was enough to take off that last guy. But regardless, their unit gets wiped out, and then they reform like that. So this was another issue with the 4x1 formation instead of the 2x2 formation, is I've now got these 2 units, and the front one, which is now weaker, is blocking up the second one, whereas, again, if they'd been in a 2x2 formation, they'd be a lot better off. And the shame is that I didn't think about this until really toward the end of the game, because right now I could have reformed with both units and fixed the problem, but I didn't do that. So this poor chariot, this is the chariot off on the left-hand side. We're now into Warrior's turn 3 movement phase. He tries to charge that flame cannon instead of the Greybeards and fails again. And I suppose it was technically a longer charge. I think it was still 11 inches or something like that, but with Swift Stride to fail 2 in a row, that was unlucky. And then this was very, very stupid on my part. Again, I haven't played games in quite some time, and it shows with moves like this. There was no reason for me to position these 2 Greybeard units like this. So, of course, the Chosen Knights, for those not watching right now, charged into the leftmost unit of Greybeards. And what's happened here is I've inadvertently exposed the flank of the second unit, and had I just angled the left unit of Greybeards a little bit more, I would have successfully done what I was trying to do, which was force the Chosen Knights to either reform after their charge and, wiping out the Greybeards, or overrun off the board. So in this case, he gets to charge them, probably wipe them out, and then charge the other unit in the flank. So that was just bad play. And then off on the right, you can see still that he's not shifting forward too much, and I guess I don't blame him at this point. Those Feldrax are still holding off in the ruins. The Greed Warriors move up a little bit to try to, hold off part of my line so that the Feldrax aren't trying to do everything at once. His magic phase is an 8-5. He uses Hellfire again to kill off the other Vengeance Seeker, which is a shame. I really like those guys. But it seems like that's kind of how they work. They have to do a lot, or they don't do anything at all. So, and then in the combat phase, because nothing else happened in Magic, in the combat phase, the Greybeards get wiped out. Well, I guess 9 of them died, 1 left, but he runs. And then, the Chosen Knights end up going into the flank of the Greybeards. Because what happens, I believe we played this correctly, but regardless, what happened in this case was he charged the flank, he wheeled as much as he possibly could, and then I wheeled to close the door to him. So that's where they ended up. And that happened on his turn. So we're now going into my turn 3. I shuffle forward with most of my line. The Greybeards here move toward the objective. And then we go into a 6-5 magic phase for me. I cast Resilience onto the Warriors again. So -1 to wound on them. And then that's where things are left off for Magic again. Usually just 1 spell for Dwarves. In the shooting phase, the Flame Cannon does 3 wounds now to the Warriors. They're still just out of close range for me, which I think is somewhere in the water. So it's unlikely that they're going to get in close range. And then the Organ Gun, again, does, I think, 3 more wounds. So we're up to 11 wounds on the unit between the 2 shooting phases. And that means they're only at, and I count now, 8 Warriors left. So they're pretty combat inefficient at this point. And then in combat, this was an interesting choice that Brett made. It surprised me. So they win in combat, predictably. I don't do any wounds to the Chosen Knights. I flee with the 4 remaining Greybeards, and he lets me go. And at first I thought he was going to reform in such a way that he was facing the Flame Cannon, so that I figured in his next turn, because again, this is my turn, in his next turn he would charge the Greybeards off the table and then redirect into the Flame Cannon, so to get both. But what he ends up doing is reforming away from the Greybeards and pretty much away from the Flame Cannon, because what he's going to try to do as a really long charge against the flank of the Deep Watch. So yeah, this is where at the end of the phase the Greybeards end up. So actually this is the beginning of his turn 4 now. So he's charged with the Chariot, because you can see here that they were over here like that, and the Chariot charged the Greybeards, and they rolled a 2 for their flee distance, so they ended up just staring at the edge of the board like that. He then redirects into the Flame Cannon and successfully charges it. Now, he did this correctly in terms of order. He did declare a charge with the Chosen Knights into the flank of the Deep Watch, and he needed, I think, an 11, but failed it. Not 11 on dice, which with Swift Stride was still a long charge, but he ends up rolling a 10, so that was very nerve-wracking for me. But he did finally successfully make it in with that Chosen Chariot. And then the Feldrax charged into the front of the Deep Watch. See, the Deep Watch would not have had a great time had those Chosen Knights made it into the flank as well. That would have been very, very bad. And then I will keep wanting to say Nurgle Warriors, the Greed Warriors, move up behind the Feldrax like that. For his magic phase, it was an 8-6. And he ends up getting off Word of Iron onto the Feldrax, which gives them +2 armor because he boosted it. And then he throws a Chemical Fire onto the Deep Watch, which sucks in this case because Feldrax have flaming attacks in the first round of combat. So he'll get rerolls to wounds against me. Then, predictably, the Chosen Chariot wipes out the Flame Cannon. However, I get a little bit lucky. So between all of his attacks, which are many, and then the rerolls to wound, he only ends up doing 6 wounds to the unit. And they stick because they're bodyguard on, I guess, a 9 in this case with Fear. And this was the one blurry picture of the lot, so I apologize for this. But this is... He had chaffed me up, I think I forgot to mention in the movement phase because it was kind of hidden in one of the pictures. But he chaffed up my line over on the right with the remaining unit of Flayers. So I charged with both. My thought process here is I got to get rid of him anyway, and I want the second unit of Hold Guardians to overrun and just get out of the way of the bigger unit. Because at this point, this is where I'm realizing that the bigger formations are not helping me. And then down here, the Greybeards rally, which is cool. And then the second unit, which is currently guarding that objective, they turn to face the combat with the Deep Watch right now. The magic is a 7-5 phase. And once again, I get lucky here. I get off both hard target distracting and -1 to wound onto the Deep Watch. At this point, all I'm trying to do is keep him alive, simply because once that king gets into those Feldrax, he'll be able to do some real work. But it's going to now take him until my following turn to get there, because he now has to chew through these Flayers. So if I can hold on for 2 more rounds of combat, I'll be good, and this certainly helps me do that. It's the best I can do. And then this is the shooting phase. The Orkan Gun, I think, plings a wound onto the Chariot there. And then in combat, yeah, the Flayers, I had him do his attacks, and then he just took them off. So the Flayers did, I think, kill the champion on that unit of warriors, and so then they reformed like that. And then the Hold Guardians overran into those ruins, and I think that's where they lost a model. Yeah, they had 3 before, so they're down to 2. Still worthwhile just to get them out of the way. And then, yeah, with all those buffs up, those poor Feldrax, and they've lost rerolls to wound at this point, too, so they're wounding me, I guess, on 4s? So, yeah, 5s to hit me, 4s to wound me. It's not super good, and then I've got a 5-up armor, 5-up ward on top of that, so... Again, they still have to hold on for 1 more turn, and he's going to be able to charge me in the flank with that Chariot, too, so we'll see how they do. This was another move that surprised me. You can see if I go back... I don't know how many slides I have to go back to see this. But he could have charged me in the flank with the whole unit of warriors, which is what I thought he was going to do. I guess I got to go back way too far. In any case, he charges the sorcerer out of the unit and into the flank of the Hold Guardians. That much didn't surprise me. It was just that he charged out of the unit with that sorcerer, so he's now exposed on his own without any static combat res, which makes him a good target for the whole Guardians and certainly for the organ gun as well. And then a bit of bad luck, he gets 2 wounds from over our charging in through the ruins. So those ruins have done quite a bit of damage. He does charge into the flank with the chariot. And then over here, I think he realized that there's really not much else for these chosen knights to do, because the chariot's now charged into the flank. He had debated, I think, charging them instead of the chariot into the flank of the Deep Watch, because they were a little closer this time, but it was another risky move because he would have had to charge the chariot out of the way first into the Greybeards, and that was a long and awkward charge for the chariot, so he could have failed with both. So I think that was the better move, the one they ended up doing. Unfortunately, that means that the Chosen Knights are kind of out of the game, so he reformed them like this to at least try to clean up those points. And then it's a 9-5 phase. This was a tough call for me. He cast Word of Iron again onto the Feldrax, gave him +2 armor. I really didn't want that up again because 2-up armor Feldrax are a nightmare. I don't know if I mentioned it, but in the last combat phase, I didn't do a single wound, even with the Thane. So I ended up letting it go off because I reasoned that even with +2 armor, if the king is charging in the next combat phase, he'll be strength 7 on the charge, so they're going to lose most of that armor anyway. And I'm not really worried about the Deep Watch doing wounds. I just don't want them to die. So I held onto my magic dice to try to stop him from making them more killy in combat. And that was all he got off in the magic phase. In the combat phase, he does win against the whole Guardians who flee. He opts not to pursue because he's still pretty gun-shy from losing 2 wounds from the charge. And he does not want to pursue through the ruins. So he holds. And then in combat, this was so nerve-wracking. Because even with both of those buffs up, you can see I lost a few more models, and there's 1 remaining. And I think as players, we all remember bad things that happen much more frequently than the good things. In other words, that we remember bad dice rolls or when things don't go our way. This was a time where things did go my way. Exactly 1 guy remained in the unit, and that was enough for them to hold with bodyguard. And otherwise, if they had failed, it would have been the collapse of my line. That chariot could have gone into the flank of the warriors. The king can't make way to the flank. It would have been bad. And I would have, of course, lost my Rune Priest and my BSB. So certainly some luck there, but I'll take it. So the whole Guardians charge the sorcerer, who's off on his own right now. He flees and takes another wound from those stupid ruins. And then the warriors, you can see, they're charging into the flank of the Feldrax as well. So this is a big, ugly combat. I had debated the Greybeards. I think this was a mistake. I charged into the flank of the chariot with those Greybeards that had been guarding that objective. And even at the time, I was debating whether or not to do this. It was silly of me. I was greedy, really, is why I did it. I wanted, if I won this combat, and I'm hoping that I do, but if I won, I wanted to be able to reform with my King's unit, overrun with what was left of the Deep Watch, and overrun, or pursue, I should say, with the Greybeard. So I wanted to be able to pursue both the Feldrax and the chariot to try to get all the points, when really all I'm doing here is introducing a lot more wounds for that chariot to attack. Because as things stand, he can only either attack my Thane, who I'm really not worried about taking wounds, or swirling melee and do potentially 1 wound to the unit of Deep Watch. So I think this was the wrong call, but we'll see how it works out. This was not my best chaff job. I saw after the movement phase was over, I was like, ooh, that's not great, but it's enough to chaff up that unit for the last 2 turns, I guess. And then in the magic phase, I get off Rune of Resilience onto the Deep Watch. This one I think he let through because there's really not much left. And then the one that mattered that I got through was -1 to wound onto the King's unit. I tried to get rerolls to wound, but he wouldn't let me have that. And then in the shooting phase, the organ gun does 1 more wound to this sorcerer who's off on his own. So he's got 1 wound remaining. It's not in a good spot, but we'll see. Yeah, this is where things sat at the end of the combat. So he does 3 wounds to me on the Greybeards, I should say, and they do nothing back to him. So they weren't really contributing anything because the King's unit was already giving me a flank. But at the end of the combat, this is where things sit. So the King alone does, I think, 7 wounds to the Feldrax. And we won the combat by something like 11 with all the static combat res. So they pursue like that. The Greybeards do end up running down the chariot. And then the Deep Watch tried to pursue the Feldrax, but they got away. So this is where everything sits at the end of the combat. So, as I mentioned before, it worked out for the Greybeards because they did get to catch that chariot, but I think it only had 2 wounds left, and it probably would have taken damage running through the water anyway. I just don't think it was worthwhile. It's just too much risk. And then this is his turn 6. So, yeah, the Chosen Knights charge into those Greybeards, and then the Feldrax do rally. And his sorcerer rallies as well. So everybody's turn to face like that. His last magic phase is a 6-4. He, I believe, with Silver Spike, does a wound to the BSB. But again, he had 4 wounds. I wasn't too worried about that. And then this is my last turn. I try to get tricky at the end here. You can see the BSB has charged out of the unit with the Rune Priest. What I was trying to do was charge him into the Feldrax, because if I had gotten lucky with that long charge, which I think was like a 9 or a 10 on my part, and then if I had killed all the warriors and overrun with the King's unit, he could have potentially overrun into the unit of Feldrax as well. So there was really no reason not to do it, but it didn't work out. And then it was 8-6 phase for me from my final magic phase. And cast something there. I'm trying to take a picture of what I cast, but I don't see what it is. Doesn't ultimately matter. In the shooting phase, I end up killing off the sorcerer with the organ gun. And I actually did the math because I think I did like 4 or 5 wounds to this guy. But I wanted to reason in my mind that it wasn't the ruins that killed him, but I suppose it was technically. And then at the end of the game, this is where everything sits. So I ended up winning the combat with the King running down the warriors, or what was left of them anyway. And everything sat like this. So it was a great game. Brett's a great opponent. And in terms of victory points at the end, because all of my characters were alive, and the whole Guardian up on the upper right ran off. So this is, other than the organ gun, everything that's on the board. It ended up being, I think it was like a 1,300 point split in my favor. So it was a, quick math, 13-7 win for the Dwarves, which with the objective became a 16-4. So it was a good game. I really like this list, and I'm going to try to play it a couple more times with minor, if any, variations. And